On Friday, August 21st, 2020, 58-year-old Aristides Polino was driving back to his home in Miami, Florida in his police SUV after completing a midnight shift. Aristides was a 25-year veteran of the Miami police force, and over the last 2+ decades, he had routinely done midnight shifts, so this was nothing new. When he got to his house, he parked his SUV in the driveway, and like always, he went right into his house. He didn't talk to his wife Clara or his son. He just went straight up to his bedroom and immediately fell asleep. About 4 hours later, at 5 p.m., Aristides woke up and he expected to hear his wife's voice somewhere in the house. So when he didn't, and the house was just totally silent, something told him that something was off. So he climbed out of bed, he put on his clothes, and he went downstairs to look for his wife. When he got down to the living room, he saw his son sitting on the couch, but he didn't see his wife. And so he asked his son, hey, have you seen your mom? And he would say, no, I haven't seen her. But sensing on his dad's face that something was wrong, he said, hey, I'll help you look for mom. And so the two men began searching the house, yelling out for Clara, and Aristides began calling his wife, but she wasn't picking up. And after several minutes, the two men reconvened in the living room, and they started going over whether or not she had told them about some appointment that day, and that would explain why she wasn't in the house. But after talking about it, they decided that she didn't have any appointments, and she should be home right now. And so the men decided, maybe she went outside and she's talking to a neighbor, or, she went for a walk and she's talking to somebody on the road. And so they decided they would go outside and search the outside of the property. When they got outside, Aristides went towards the back of the property and his son went towards the front, down towards the driveway. And so as Aristides is making his way around the back of the property, he hears his son scream out for help. Aristides comes running back around the property and he sees his son standing in the driveway with the door of his police SUV wide open. 4 hours earlier, after Aristides came home, he parked his police SUV right in the driveway like he always did, and for some reason he left the car unlocked. And so he goes in the house and he falls asleep. And while he was sleeping, Clara, who was home, she exited the house and walked down the driveway to his SUV. She opened up the door and went inside. It's believed she was looking for something, although we don't know what she was looking for. And while she was in the back of his car fishing around for whatever it was she was looking for, the door she had entered the vehicle in shut behind her. And because this is a police SUV, the back seat was designated for suspects. And so the back two doors did not open from the inside. And there was a very thick partition separating the back seat from the front seat. So Clara could not just reach over the seats and honk the horn to get someone's attention. And Clara did not have her cell phone, so she couldn't call anyone for help. And when she screamed out for help to somebody out on the road to help her, her screams were severely muffled, and the back windows of this police car were heavily tinted, making it extremely difficult to see that there was a person in the back seat of this car. So for 4 hours, Clara desperately screamed and kicked and punched and did everything she could to try to free herself from the situation she was in. All the while, the temperature inside the car continued to go up. The SUV was parked in full sunlight, no shade whatsoever, and the temperatures that day were over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And so by the time Clara was ultimately discovered, the inside of that SUV had effectively become an oven. Aristides ran over to his vehicle and he pulled his wife out and he started doing CPR on her, but it was too late. She had died of heat stroke. Her death was ultimately ruled an accident. It was 2 days before Christmas in 2010, and 54-year-old Alan Catterall, along with his future son-in-law Mark, were sitting in the break room of a kayak molding facility in the United Kingdom where they both worked. And as they sat there drinking tea, they began exchanging notes about what gifts they got for the rest of their family for the holidays. And as they spoke, they both were very careful to keep their voices very quiet in fear that someone might overhear them, because Alan's wife and daughter also worked at this kayak company. Alan had worked for this company for 10 years, and even though it was backbreaking work a lot of the time, he loved it because it meant he got to spend all this time with his family basically 24/7. It was only 7 a.m., which meant Mark and Alan had just started their shifts, but they were already taking this break to talk about Christmas because they were so excited about it. But they finally said, okay, we do need to go to work, and so they put their cups in the sink, and then Alan made his way down to the factory floor, and his future son-in-law Mark made his way up to the control room. On the factory floor, where Alan was heading, was where all the special machinery was inside of these little rooms where the kayaks were actually molded and put together. And it was Alan's job to make sure the machinery was clean and operational. The machinery inside of these little kayak-making rooms was very customized and very finicky, and so Alan was one of the few people at the company who really understood what made it work and what would cause issues, and so he was very valuable at the company. That day, Alan knew one of the circuit boards for one of these molding rooms had shorted out, and so the leadership had decided to shut down that particular molding room while the circuit board was fixed. And so when Alan went down and began checking out each of these molding rooms, he knew which one had been shut down. So he knew when he went in there, it was not going to be operational. But when he went into that particular molding room, he noticed that it really needed a good clean. When these kayaks were made inside of these molding rooms, a lot of times the excess plastic would kind of seep out of the actual mold, and it would get caked to the walls, and it would flake all over the ground. And so periodically, Alan would clean these rooms, and he figured right now, with this one shut down, he might as well clean it. And so Alan grabbed a crowbar, and he headed into this shut-down molding room, and he got to work chipping all this plastic off the walls and making a big pile on the ground to sweep out and throw away. But as Alan chipped away at all the plastic, the doors leading into this molding room shut. And so suddenly Alan was cast into total darkness because his only light before that had been coming through these doors. But that was the least of Alan's worries. He knew that if these doors were shutting, these doors were automatic, that meant that the circuit board had to have been fixed, and they didn't know he was in here. And so now this molding room must be operational, which meant he only had minutes to get out of this room. And so Alan ran to the door, and with his crowbar, he began trying to pry the doors open, but he couldn't. These are mechanically sealed doors. They do not just open. You need to press a button to release them. But Alan's in a total panic. He knows what happens in this room, and he just can't get the doors open. And so he began banging on the door with his crowbar and screaming for anybody out in the factory floor to please stop this process that's surely starting inside of this room. Open these doors, get me out of here. But it was so loud out on the factory floor, nobody heard him. And so before long, Alan must have looked around and saw the walls inside of this tight, cramped space beginning to glow red. Because this molding room was actually just an oven. It reached almost 600 degrees Fahrenheit in about 10 minutes. And so Alan is watching as this oven is restarting, and he's sealed inside of it. And so the walls turned bright red, and then before long, the crowbar he was using to try to open the door must have become so hot he couldn't have held it, and then the ground as well would have been red hot, and his shoes would have begun to melt, and then the air temperature inside would have gotten so unbelievably hot he couldn't have breathed. And so screaming in pain and pounding on the door, leaving his skin on the door every time he hit it, Alan eventually just collapsed to the ground in unimaginable pain as he cooked alive. Finally, when Alan caught on fire and black smoke began coming off of his body and pouring out onto the factory floor, the factory realized there's a problem with this molding room, so they turned it off, they opened it up, and they discovered Alan. It would turn out, after Mark and Alan had chatted about Christmas in the break room and then parted and gone their own ways, Alan had gone down to the factory floor and inside of that molding room, and his future son-in-law, Mark, had gone up to the control room where he would have no visibility of the factory floor. All he had was this big switchboard full of lights and switches and gauges that controlled all of the molding rooms. And not long after he got up there and was looking at the control panel, he saw a blinking light come on. And it was for the molding room that Alan was working inside of. And that blinking light meant someone had fixed the circuit board, and so that molding room now had power. And so reflexively, Mark just turned it on. And when he did that, the molding room began its restart process, which included sealing its doors and turning on the oven. And inside of that molding room, there were no safety escapes. In fact, there was really no safety precautions at all with regards to these ovens. And so as soon as Mark flipped that switch, he had killed his future father-in-law. 5 years later, the kayak molding company was convicted of corporate manslaughter and fined 200,000 pounds. Also, the man who actually designed these molding rooms with no safety precautions in mind, no emergency exits, nothing, He was fined £25,000 and sentenced to jail for 9 months. On January 30th, 1925, a 37-year-old man named Floyd Collins walked through this huge forest in central Kentucky inside of a national park. As he walked along, his boots splashed in the melting snow and mud on the ground, and above him, all he heard was the sound of water dripping down amongst the leaves. It was warmer than it had been in several days, and so that was why Floyd was out here. He was trying to take advantage of the nice weather. And so after walking for a while on this muddy, slushy trail, the trees around Floyd began to thin out, and then eventually he reached the edge of the tree line, and in front of him was this huge clearing. Now, in this clearing, the trail he was on continued straight ahead, but it came to a stop in front of this huge cavern-like opening in the side of a hill. And so without hesitation, Floyd stepped out of the trees into the sunlight, and he walked the rest of the trail right up to the opening of this cavern, and he stopped and just stared and smiled. This cavern-like space on the side of this hill was the entrance to a cave known as Sand Cave. And Floyd had spent the last week coming out to Sand Cave and exploring the different tunnels, but today his plan was to go as deep and as far inside of this cave as he possibly could. Caves were a huge tourist attraction in this region, and Floyd was a very experienced caver who had been caving since he was 6 years old, and he knew that most of Sand Cave had not been explored. And so if he could go in there and explore all the different parts of the cave and map it all out and make sure it was safe, it was sure to be a huge moneymaker. He could bring people here and lead them on guided tours. So Floyd left the muddy path he had been walking on and stepped foot inside of this grand entrance to Sand Cave. It's basically this 250-foot wide cathedral-like space inside of this hill with ceilings high enough you could stand, but it's totally dark in there. And despite being this big open space, it very quickly funnels to this one kind of tunnel that goes straight down and connects to all these offshoot underground passageways, many of which have never been explored before. And so, as Floyd walked across this big open entryway, he lit his oil lamp and then began mentally preparing himself for what he was about to do, which was going to be very claustrophobia-inducing, even for a very experienced caver. And so Floyd reached the back of this huge entryway, and he reached this tunnel that would connect to the rest of the cave, and he began walking down it. And this tunnel was not very restricting. You could stand in it, you could move around in it, but it was very short. It was 15 feet straight down at an angle, where at the bottom of those 15 feet was a square hole in the ground. And Floyd, having been here the previous week, knew that once you go through this hole, the real caving begins. Now you're going to be down on your hands and knees, wriggling your way through these very tight and restricting areas where you don't really know where you're going. Because again, a lot of this stuff has never been explored before. But this is why Floyd loved caving. He loved the adventure and the risk of doing things like this. And so Floyd got to this hole, he put his oil lamp down on the ground, he casually lowered himself feet first into this hole, which dropped down several feet, and then once he was on firm ground, he reached up, grabbed his oil lamp, and pulled it into the hole with him. Once he was inside of this lower level space, he crouched down and looked around, and off to his right was a tunnel that he could crawl through that seemed to lead to a series of other tunnels. And so he puts his lamp in front of him, he gets down, and he begins crawling through this tunnel. And after a little while, he reaches this kind of fork in the road where he had several options of very narrow tunnels to choose from. Now, the previous week, Floyd had gone down several of these tunnels and mapped out where they went, but there was one tunnel in particular at this fork that was very narrow. It was likely the most narrow of all the tunnels, but from where he had seen the last week, it looked like it went pretty far without obstruction. And so he immediately began going headfirst into this tunnel where he had no idea where it was going to go. Think about that. If you go headfirst into a tunnel and you get stuck, what are you going to do? You can't really go anywhere. So this guy is like totally fearless, just going headfirst into what most people would consider a nightmare scenario. And so the way Floyd would approach these very tight tunnels is he would put his oil lamp out in front of him, and then he'd keep his hands over his head, and he'd kind of wriggle his way head first and push his lamp along the way. And so that's what he did. He began going into this really restrictive tunnel. It's hard to breathe because the walls are so tight on his chest cavity. But as he's going, eventually the ceiling begins to slope upward just enough that he can pull himself up onto his hands and knees and kind of catch his breath. By this point, Floyd was approximately 55 feet underground. That's where this little pocket was, where he could get up on his hands and knees and breathe. And so from this position, he still could see with his lamp that this tunnel continued to snake further and further down, and his hope was that eventually it would lead to a big underground chamber that was not just big enough to go to your hands and knees on, but was big enough you could stand and walk around in, because those were the big tourist attractions. Not only because it seems like another world underground that you can fully explore and walk around in, but also, as Floyd knew from his past experience of going into other caves, a lot of times those big underground chambers are full of Native American artifacts. And again, that was a huge potential moneymaker for people like Floyd because it allowed him to advertise that this cave where tourists could go explore was full of all this rich history. And so Floyd eventually, after catching his breath in this little spot, got back down onto his stomach with his hands out in front of him with the lamp out ahead of his fingers, and he began going deeper and deeper into this unexplored section of Sand Cave. And as he inched along, even though the ceiling remained very tight on top of him, he's totally compressed to the ground, the walls on either side of him began to expand, which meant Floyd, if he wanted to, could actually turn himself around, although he couldn't stand up. And so Floyd is making his way down this very low ceiling area when he notices his oil lamp is beginning to flicker, which means it's going to go out soon. Now, Floyd wasn't concerned about suddenly being in the darkness inside of a cave. Now, to most people, that would be terrifying, but Floyd, again, was so experienced, he was very confident that he could easily make his way out again just by touch. He didn't need the light. But he did know that trying to move around inside of a cave in the darkness was dangerous, and so he should not do that if he could avoid it. And so as much as Floyd wanted to continue and hopefully find something incredible inside of this cave, he decided he really needed to just turn around and go back to the surface and come back the next day to continue exploring. And so, because this part of the tunnel he was in was really wide, he was able to turn himself around and drag his lamp until he was facing back uphill, and then he rolled onto his back. So his head is pointing back up where he came from, and his feet are pointing in the direction that he had previously been traveling, and he's on his back. And so his oil lamp is above his head. He can move his arms side to side because, again, it's pretty wide in the area he's in, but his head is pretty restricted by the ceiling. And he began inching with his heels and pushing with his arms, moving up the tunnel on his back. And as he would move, he'd use his head and his hands to push the oil lamp back up the direction he was going. And for a little while, this system worked great. But at some point, right as he was getting close to that area where he was able to previously get on his hands and knees and catch his breath, Floyd accidentally kind of rushed and pushed his lamp too hard and knocked it over, which extinguished the light. And so suddenly, Floyd was cast into total darkness. Now, again, Floyd was not concerned or really even scared about being in darkness inside of this cave, but this was not a good scenario and he knew it. But he told himself, stay calm. He knew where he was in the cave. He just needed to get to that little pocket. He'd catch his breath, and then he'd continue his way back up, eventually reach that hole in the ceiling, that square hole. He'd climb out, make his way out of the cave, and boom, he'd be done. And so Floyd just continued to push the now extinguished oil lamp above his head, and he continued to inch with his heels and moved his arms around to keep going backwards up this tunnel. But then, right before Floyd reached that pocket inside of the tunnel where he could get onto his hands and knees, he heard the sound of falling rocks somewhere below him, kind of near his legs. Now it's pitch black, he can't see anything, and so Floyd just kind of held his breath and hoped that whatever was happening wouldn't affect him, but then he felt a shooting pain in his left leg. A 27-pound rock had broken loose from the low ceiling and landed on his left ankle. Now, at first, Floyd was actually relieved that the rock had landed only on his left leg. And in fact, his leg was actually kind of positioned in a depression on the floor of the cave. And so the rock didn't really hit his left ankle directly. It kind of like hit the ground and then leaned onto his left ankle. And his left ankle was kind of protected in the depression in the cave floor. And so Floyd's thinking, thank goodness it only landed on my ankle and not on my head or my chest, because then I'd be dead. And so, after catching his breath and kind of calming down, Floyd tensed his body and pulled his left leg as hard as he could to clear this 27-pound rock, but his foot wouldn't budge. And so, Floyd thought he would just reach down and kind of dig his foot out. He'd just move the rock out of the way. But even though this cave had widened out on either side of Floyd when he had gone deeper and deeper into it, because he had retraced his steps, he was farther up the tunnel where those sides had really come in much closer to him. And so he wasn't able to actually reach down and touch the rock. The walls made it impossible. And so he wasn't able to use his hands to clear this rock. And so Floyd is pinned underground, unable to move, in absolute pitch darkness, inside of a cave that's practically crushing his chest because the ceiling is so low, and he knows it's unstable. The ceiling has now fallen off, so there's a chance more rocks could come in at any time. I mean, this is like a worst case scenario for anybody who goes caving. But Floyd told himself to just stay calm. He knew this was a very bad situation, but people were certain to find out he was missing, and they knew he had gone to Sand Cave, and they would come here, they would find him, and they would rescue him. And so Floyd just decided he would wait. And for an agonizing 30 hours, remember, 30 hours of pitch blackness, trapped in a totally claustrophobic environment. 30 hours of this, no food, no water, can't go to the bathroom. He's laying there for 30 hours, and then finally, he hears a voice coming from somewhere near the entrance of this cave. And when he heard that voice, it was like the sweetest sound he had ever heard. Because not only did they represent help, but the voice was coming from Floyd's brother, Homer, who was also a very experienced caver. And so Floyd's thinking, thank goodness, I'm saved. And so Homer was able to navigate from the entrance down all the way to the tunnel that Floyd was in, and Homer got to that spot in the tunnel where Floyd had gone to his hands and knees, that pocket there. So Homer's in that pocket, and he can see Floyd is only a few feet away from him. He can see Floyd's head right there. And so Homer, who had a lamp, he shines the light on Floyd, and the two brothers don't waste any time with small talk. Instead, Homer, who had his oil lamp, had set it up right next to them, and he began feeding Floyd sausage sandwiches and giving him sips of water. And then Homer would tell Floyd that he just did not have the equipment to help Floyd get out right now, but Homer was going to go back to the surface, get men, get supplies, and then come back and save Floyd. And so Floyd is very thankful, he's very relieved, he says goodbye to Homer, and Homer turns and makes his way back up to the surface. 15 hours later, Homer would return by himself, and so at this point, Floyd has been trapped for 45 hours. And so Floyd, he's laying there kind of in and out of consciousness, and he hears the sound of Homer calling out to him, and then he hears the sound of Homer chiseling away at some rocks. It would turn out Homer's plan to save Floyd was basically to chisel away the side of this section of tunnel that Floyd was stuck in order to be able to reach down and somehow, some way, clear the rock off of Floyd's leg and then pull Floyd up. Now, Floyd understood, of course, that this plan of chiseling away the side of this tunnel to make it wider was going to take some time, but luckily Homer had shown up with more food and water, and they chatted the whole time as Homer worked, and so Floyd was in good spirits, and Homer was very optimistic. But after 8 hours of Homer slowly chiseling his way, widening this tunnel, he hadn't made much progress, and he was totally exhausted. I mean, you gotta remember that the angle he was working at was horrible. He was basically crouched down on his hands and knees, chipping away at this rock. And so after those 8 hours, Homer would leave Floyd and go back home and sleep and eat and drink and kind of recover. But he told Floyd, don't worry, tomorrow more men will be here to help chisel away this tunnel and get Floyd out of there. But over the course of the next 50 hours, Floyd remained trapped inside of this tunnel with the rock pinning his leg, and despite Homer and several other men getting down there and very diligently chipping away at this tunnel, it just was not happening very quickly. And so over the course of those 50 hours, Homer began going in and out of consciousness, and he began not being able to differentiate between what was real and what was not. At one point, he would say that he believed the cave had kind of opened up and these angels riding golden chariots with flaming wheels had come in to save him. And as they were lifting him out of the cave, he smelled food and coffee. And then suddenly his hallucination cleared and he realized he was trapped in the darkness all alone, still in this cave. And it was like it destroyed his morale. And so Floyd is really starting to go downhill, and the rescuers are realizing they need to do something, and they need to do something now. But at the 130-hour mark, things got even worse for Floyd. As he was laying there in the tunnel, this was sometime in the middle of the night, and so no rescuers were actively down there trying to chisel their way down to him. He was laying there and he was listening to the sound of the running water somewhere outside the cave, and that sound was kind of amplified down to him, and then all of a sudden he heard the sound of falling rocks somewhere up above, and then when those rocks stopped and it went silent again, he could not hear the sound of the running water. It was very muffled. And that was when he realized that there must have been a cave-in somewhere higher up in the cave, which meant potentially there could be a significant block just to get down to him. Forget about widening this tunnel. I mean, he could be actually entombed inside of Sand Cave. And so Floyd did the only thing he could do, which was to pray. It would turn out that cave-in had indeed blocked the way for rescuers to get down to Floyd. And because of how extensive this cave-in was, the rescuers actually decided to start carving a brand new tunnel that would join up with the side of Floyd's tunnel. I mean, this is an even bigger undertaking than just chiseling the side of the tunnel that Floyd was in, which was their original plan and had taken several days. And so now they have to build this brand new tunnel to Floyd. And so finally, on February 16th, 1925, so a staggering 17 days from the time Floyd got first stuck in this cave, the rescue team finally punched through and reached Floyd. And as soon as they did, the lead rescuer looked over at Floyd, and then he paused, he turned up, and he just said, "Dead." It would turn out shortly after that cave-in, which sealed Floyd in completely inside of Sand Cave, at some point over the next couple of days, those rocks began to break free and tumble down the cave and began striking Floyd until finally one or several of those rocks hit him in the head or chest and killed him. So just imagine you are trapped. You've been there for several days. You're in total darkness. You're entombed inside of this cave. And periodically, rocks just come tumbling down and smash into you. Who knows how long it took to kill him, but that has to be one of the most agonizing ways to go ever. In April of 2020, a 17-year-old named Sam, who was an avid outdoorsman, decided to go on a one-night hike in the Superstition Mountains in Arizona. The mountain's name has a bunch of supposed origins, but the one that's generally accepted is people are afraid of the Superstition Mountains because of all the mysterious deaths that have occurred there. And so because people would avoid these mountains in fear of mysterious death, it became these Superstitious Mountains. But Sam was not superstitious and regularly came out here to go hiking, in particular on this 8-mile loop that went through a canyon. And so this one night overnight he planned on doing was going to be on that 8-mile loop where he'd do 4 miles in, camp out, and then 4 miles back. And he planned to do it with a friend, but his friend at the last minute canceled, and so Sam teetered on not even doing it, but ultimately decided, okay, I'll just do it by myself because I'm very familiar with this area. On the day he was supposed to go do this hike, he had planned on getting there early in the day to have maximum lighting, but due to some unforeseen circumstances and traffic and bad road conditions, he didn't get to the trailhead until 5:45 p.m. that night. Sam knew it was a bad idea to start this hike so late because he was going to run out of daylight. He probably was not going to make it 4 miles to the point where he planned on camping out, but he figured with his good health and fitness, he could probably quickly make his way to the 2 or even 3 mile mark, and there were some suitable campsites there. And so he decided he would kind of risk it and just try to go as fast as he could and use the daylight he had to reach a suitable campsite. But he wasn't able to move as fast as he thought he could, and soon the sun was down and it's totally dark and he's got his flashlight, but that only is able to shine like 10 feet in front of him. And then at one point he nearly falls off of this rock, and he knows had he fallen, he would have gotten really badly hurt, and he's 15 miles away from the nearest help, and he's in a bad cell phone service area, and the roads getting out here are treacherous. No one knows exactly where he is, and it dawns on him that you've made a pretty bad choice, and you should stop right now and make camp here and not try to risk it any further. And so as it happened, where he was, there was this forest right nearby, and he could see there was a clearing about 30 feet off the path when he shined his light. And so he walked into that clearing, and he found it was a great spot to make camp. And in fact, on the edge of this clearing was the remnants of a fire pit. It was very old, but it at least showed someone had camped out right here, and they seemed to have made it just fine. So suddenly he was feeling pretty smart, and he felt pretty good about where he was staying for the night. Now, Sam intentionally did not bring a tent. He liked to sleep on a sleeping pad with a sleeping bag over that, and then he would string up a tarp over the top of him in case it rained. And since this clearing was surrounded by a bunch of pine trees, he was able to string up his tarp over the top, and it was perfect. And pretty soon he had a fire going, and then he cracked open a can of beans, and he began eating his dinner. And as he was eating, he started to get a sense that something was off, something was not right. He began scanning the tree line as if he was going to find something out of the ordinary, but his visibility was incredibly limited because he was sitting right up against a fire. And if you've ever sat next to a fire in a dark forest, your visibility is like 5 feet in a circle around the fire. You really cannot see beyond that. And his vision was also limited by all the pine trees that encircled his clearing. So he really could only see what was immediately around him, nothing else. And he starts thinking, that's got to be it. Maybe I'm just nervous because I have no visibility. But as he's rationalizing this kind of bad gut feeling, a rock the size of a marble comes soaring into the campsite and lands at his feet. And he looks down at the rock, and immediately he connects that to that sense of dread he had. And he's looking around a little more aggressively now, but again, his vision is very, very limited. And so for the next 15 minutes, Sam is really aggressively scanning the tree line and listening really intently, and he doesn't hear anything, he doesn't see any more rocks get thrown. And so he begins to rationalize and convince himself that there's nothing wrong here. That feeling I have, oh, don't worry about that. He starts telling himself, I must have kicked a rock, that's what it is. Or maybe a rock fell off a tree. But either way, it's something totally explainable and you got nothing to worry about. And after a little while, he convinced himself and he got into his sleeping bag under his tarp and he went to sleep. A couple of hours later, Sam wakes up and he has that same sense of dread, and now it's back with a vengeance. And he can't hear anything, he can't see anything, but he's definitely feeling like something is wrong. And at that moment, as he's listening really intently and looking really carefully, he hears the sound of rustling leaves. It sounds like someone walking through leaves about 30 or 40 meters away from his campsite. And initially, he can't tell if this person or animal is walking towards his campsite or away, but over the next 30 seconds or so, the sounds start to fade, and he convinces himself that, okay, they've left and everything's fine. But just in case, he wanted to grab his flashlight and shine it in that direction, and so he reaches next to him where he had left it when he had gone to bed a couple hours earlier, and he can't find his flashlight. And he's looking around for it, and he can't find it, and he's like, man, that's weird, I had it right here, right next to my body, and it's not here anymore. And that's when the alarm bells start going off in his head, because the only way this flashlight moves is if he moved it. And if it's not here, how did it move? And so he jumps out of his sleeping bag, he ducks out from under the tarp, and he's looking around on the ground in the immediate vicinity of where he was sleeping to find this flashlight. And as he's looking, out of the corner of his eye, he sees some light. And he turns his head, and in the same direction that he had heard those footsteps, those rustling leaves, when he was still laying down, he sees his flashlight laying on the ground about 10 meters away. Which means someone or something had been less than a foot away from him to get this flashlight that was right next to him while he was fast asleep and totally helpless, and had moved it all the way over there. And immediately, Sam thinks to himself, that's a trap. They are trying to lure me away from my campsite. Suddenly, he felt so scared he wanted to vomit, but he knew in order to survive this situation, he needed to keep his wits about him. So he puts his boots on and he grabs his knife, and he knows he's not leaving this campsite. In fact, he's going to build the biggest fire he can. He's going to stoke that fire as big as he can get it, and he's not going to go anywhere near that flashlight. For the next several hours, Sam just stood in the middle of his campsite holding his knife, preparing to confront whatever the heck is out in the woods. And over those several hours, he would hear footsteps approach his campsite, turn around, and leave. Every time the fire got lower, he noticed they would come closer and closer and closer, and when he would stoke the fire, they wouldn't come as close. But at about 3 a.m., he ran out of firewood. So unless he went into the woods to get more, he'd be out. And he's certainly not going into the woods. That's the whole point, is to avoid the woods where this thing is. And so as the fire died down, Sam prepared himself mentally for whatever happened next, because he knew that with that fire gone, this thing was comfortable coming all the way in, coming all the way up right next to him to get the flashlight. And so finally, he hears the footsteps approaching, and before this, the closest they had come was maybe about 15 meters away. They were far enough away it didn't feel intimate. It was terrifying, but he had some distance. This time, they walk right up to about 3 meters away, but they intentionally come behind the thickest group of trees, so he can't see them, and it's still dark outside, and he's in that bubble of light near the fire, so he's blind to whatever's on the other side of those trees, but he knows they're there, and they've stopped. And for 2 hours, this poor kid is standing in the middle of this campsite, facing in the direction of whatever is behind the trees. Probably his imagination is going crazy at this point with what could be behind those trees, just waiting for whatever happened next. But ultimately, the only thing that would happen is the sun would eventually come up, and right before it actually popped over the horizon, this thing on the other side finally moved, it turned around and ran away, and it did not come back. And so when the sun finally did come up, Sam didn't just charge out of there because he's still thinking there could be a trap. He waited until it was totally full sunlight, and then he packed up everything he had, and he practically sprinted back to the parking lot, back into his car, and he drove nonstop for 20 miles until he got to a gas station where he could park and collect himself. And when he got there, he got out of his car, and he went in and he got a drink, and when he came out, he noticed someone had written something on the dust on the back window of his car. And he walks over and it just says, "Sleep well?" ? Sam is confident whoever was stalking him at his campsite is the same person or group of people that wrote this message on his car. And now Sam just wonders, what would have happened if I retrieved that flashlight? Our next story is called It Started with a Whistle. In 2017, 27-year-old Lydia Makarchuk left her home country of Ukraine and moved to Bracknell, which is a town just outside of London. Shortly after moving into her new apartment, Lydia went out and got a job as an accountant at a local hotel, and then after that, Lydia pretty much swore off her social life and instead just focused exclusively on working hard and saving money. The one reprieve she got from work was going to church on Sundays. 2 years later, Lydia was at her church enjoying the coffee hour that always followed the Sunday sermon when another member of her church, who she didn't really speak to, this 41-year-old man named Norbert Varga, approached her and kind of awkwardly complimented her shoes. And she was so flattered by this that it opened up a friendly conversation between the two of them. And during this conversation, Lydia was pleasantly surprised to find out that Norbert was an expat too. An expat is someone who lives outside of their native country. Norbert had moved to the UK in 2018, so that's 1 year after Lydia had moved to the UK, and he came from Hungary, which shares a border with Ukraine. And just like Lydia, when he got to the UK, he kind of put all his energy into his work and trying to save money. He was a radio technician and a photographer. And so the two spend the rest of this coffee hour chatting and enjoying each other's company. And then afterwards, when they left the church and they both got home, they both found themselves thinking about the other. There was clearly an attraction there. And so the following Sunday, they both very eagerly rushed back to church in order to spend more time together. And sure enough, during that coffee hour, they spent the whole time together just chatting it up. And then afterwards, they exchanged phone numbers and made plans to get together outside of church. They were going to go on a date. And so the rest, as they say, is history. 2 years after Norbert complimented Lydia's shoes, they got married in Bracknell. And while the wedding was great, unfortunately, none of Lydia's family members, who were all in Ukraine, none of them could attend the actual wedding. And so the newlywed couple decided the way they would handle that is their honeymoon would be spent in Ukraine. That way Lydia's family could celebrate their wedding as well. For a variety of reasons, this honeymoon trip to Ukraine kept getting pushed back, but finally in September of 2021, everything lined up, everyone was available, and so Norbert and Lydia rushed to the airport and they hopped on a flight. And during this flight to Ukraine, Lydia remembers being so excited specifically about her husband finally getting a chance to spend some time with her 29-year-old younger brother Miroslav. Lydia was very close with her brother, and so it mattered to her greatly that he and her husband had a good relationship. But to that point, because of the great physical distance between the UK and Ukraine, the two had really not had that much interaction, and so they really didn't know each other very well. And so this trip was really important to Lydia, and Miroslav, he really picked up on that because he put together this camping trip for the end of their stay in Ukraine, where he knew he'd be able to step aside with Norbert and chat with him and get to know him a little bit. And so that was kind of like the fail-safe, where if he and Norbert did not get a chance to speak all week because they were visiting with so many people, they would have a chance to at the end of the week on this camping trip. So after a few hours of flying, Lydia and Norbert touch down in Ukraine, and they make their way to Lydia's family's house where they're going to be staying for the week. And that night, and for the next several days, the couple was swamped with several family reunions and meetups with old friends that hadn't seen Lydia in years. And so Norbert and Miroslav were not getting any time to themselves, and Lydia really knew that. And so she and Norbert began looking forward to this camping trip, because that not only represented a kind of peaceful break from the chaos of all these reunions, but it also did represent the one chance they knew Miroslav and Norbert would get to interact with each other. And so finally, September 15th, the end of the week, it came, and it was time to go on this camping trip. And so Lydia and Norbert and Miroslav and 9 other family members, they all packed up their tents and their camping belongings, and they loaded up a couple of cars, and they drove over to the base of the Carpathian mountain range. This mountain range, which stretches for nearly 1,000 miles across Eastern and Central Europe, are very popular amongst tourists because it's stunningly beautiful. Everything is green and lush, and there are these crystal clear lakes and breathtaking waterfalls and all these amazing animals running around, and there's no mosquitoes, and they have these really cool hikes that bring you up to these very impressive overlooks. And so that night, Miroslav had made reservations for this one campsite, this very popular campsite that was up in this clearing, not too far up the mountain, and it had this great view down to the forest below, and because it was in a clearing, it had this unobstructed view up to the sky, where in this area, you could look up and just see stars in every direction. And so when Lydia and the rest of this group arrived in the parking lot of this mountain range, they were all really excited to get up to this campsite and just enjoy being there. And so they park their cars, they get their gear out, they find the trailhead, and then they begin hiking up the mountain. And about 2 hours later, they arrive at this clearing. They find their campsite, which was marked by this small fire pit underneath a couple of trees. And so they go over and they set their tents up, and some people go out and get some firewood. And then before long, a fire was made, and this group of 12 people that had not seen each other in so long, they just sat down and began enjoying each other's company. They put tea on, they were swapping stories. It was really just this wonderful time. And then around 8 p.m., the sun started to set, at which point this huge group just stopped and enjoyed this beautiful sunset. And then once the sun had gone down, there were 2 kids that were there on this trip, and so they were put to bed in their tent. And then the remaining 10 adults just kind of hung out by the fire and enjoyed each other's company. And it was actually during this second half of the night that Norbert and Miroslav finally really got a chance to just chat with each other. So for about an hour, they were talking to each other, and Lydia is just watching this happen, and she couldn't be happier. This is like the perfect ending to this trip. And then around 9 p.m., Norbert stands up. Lydia sees him stand up, and he tells the group he's going to run back to his tent, which was a ways away from the campfire, and he was going to get his camera. And so Lydia said, okay, no problem. And she remembers watching him walk off into the distance, because when you're at the campfire, if you're looking away from the campfire, everything is pitch black in that direction. And so she watches him disappear into the darkness, and then she and her brother and everyone else just kind of turn back towards the campfire. And then all she remembers about what happens next is she heard a whistling sound. And at first it was very faint, but it started to get very, very loud. And when it got loud, she tried to kind of figure out where it was. But before she could, suddenly something hit her in the face, predominantly hit her in the nose. And as soon as it did, she went blind, she went deaf, and then she felt herself on the ground, and she has no idea what's going on. And all she can remember thinking is, oh my God, something horrible has happened to me. I might die. I don't know what's happening, but I might die. And so she started praying for herself to survive whatever was happening to her. And then her hearing started to come back just a little bit. Her vision was still totally blurred. She could only kind of tell where the fire was because it was bright. But her hearing, it started to come back. And that's when she heard moaning coming from somewhere near her. And so she's thinking, okay, whatever horrible thing has happened to me has happened to other people too. And so instead of just praying for herself, she began praying for everyone who was at this campsite. And so as her hearing is getting louder and louder, and she's hearing more and more moaning and crying happening all around her, she suddenly hears her husband screaming her name. Her vision is still gone, but she knows it's him, and he lands right behind her and he grabs her and he's just repeating her name over and over and over again. And then Lydia manages to kind of choke out to her husband what happened. And there's a pause, and then Norbert says to her, "It's bad. It's really bad." It would turn out their campsite was on a battlefield from World War I, and buried underneath the soil right under their fire pit was an unexploded bomb from World War I. Meaning, for over 100 years, countless campers have arrived at this campsite and lit fires on top of this bomb that they couldn't see. And each fire gradually eroded the outer metal casing of this explosive until finally that night in September, with Lydia and 11 of her loved ones nearby, their little fire finally was it. It pushed through that last little bit of the casing and it ignited the bomb and it detonated. That whistling that she heard was the sound of the fire finally cutting through that casing and being exposed to the fire. And then that thing that struck her in the face, that hit her right on the nose, that was almost certainly a piece of the bomb itself, so shrapnel that was cutting through her face. And then the moaning she heard was primarily her brother, who was right next to her. Lydia would be gravely wounded, but she would survive. As for her brother and another man who was not named, they would not survive. The next and final story of today's episode is called Thorns. In 2012, a 22-year-old woman named Simone was living in a small winemaking village called Rüdesheim am Rhein, which is located in southwestern Germany. This village is strikingly beautiful. It's full of quaint European homes, and there's lots of rolling green hills with vineyards as far as the eye can see, and the village sits right on the banks of the Rhine River. Simone had grown up in this picturesque village, and she had loved it, but this was going to be her last summer before she left and headed off to New York City to start the next chapter of her life. And while she was excited about that, she was also kind of sad because this village and everybody inside of it were the only things she had ever known, and so the idea of leaving them behind just seemed very strange to her. But instead of focusing on the kind of growing anxiety around her imminent departure from Germany, she focused on what she would be doing that summer while she was still in Germany. Some of Simone's fondest memories of her childhood were of her time spent at summer camp. And this summer camp was located in this forest that was not far from her village. And every summer in July, Simone, along with about 200 other kids from her village and from neighboring villages, would converge on the campgrounds in the forest for 2 weeks of playing games and going on scavenger hunts and putting on stage plays and just generally having a really good time. But when Simone became a teenager and was too old to be a camp attendee, she decided she would volunteer and be a camp counselor. And she found it was awesome. She immediately connected with the other camp counselors, and she felt all grown up, having a real job, and she loved goofing around with all of the kids. And so every summer since that first time volunteering, Simone had gone back and volunteered again. And this summer was no different. So, in mid-July of that year, Simone packed up her things and she headed off to the forest. The way this camp worked was the 200 plus kids that were attending the camp, they would get dropped off in the mornings each day by their parents, and they'd play and run around all day. And then in the late afternoon, their parents would come back and pick them up. So none of the kids were sleeping over at the camp during these 2 weeks. However, the 30 plus counselors, they would just stay at the camp for the full 2 weeks. They would just sleep in tents out in the forest. Technically, the reason they did this was to make sure they had enough time in the morning to prep the campgrounds for the kids, and then also in the evenings to have enough time to clean up and kind of have it ready for the next day. But in reality, Simone and the other counselors all knew that the camping out in the forest was the best part of the volunteer experience. After all the kids went home for the night, all of the counselors would finish up all of their duties and then rush off into the forest where their tents were and where there was a fire pit, and they would have some beers and wine because the legal drinking age in Germany is actually 16. So all these counselors are having a couple of drinks, and then before long they'd be laughing and telling stories and just generally having a great time. So that July in 2012, Simone and the other counselors arrived at the campgrounds a day early, and they caught up with each other and they prepared the campground. And then the next morning, all the kids showed up and everything went off without a hitch. And then that afternoon, after all the kids had been picked up by their parents, Simone and the other counselors rushed to finish up all their duties and then headed off into the woods to enjoy their first night hanging out together. After a couple of beers had been passed around the campfire, everybody was in good spirits and laughing and telling stories. But pretty quickly, people started to fade and get tired because, it was their first day back at camp and it had been a long, tiring day. And so people very gradually began retiring to their tents to go to bed. And eventually Simone, too, had crawled into her tent and gotten onto her cot to try to sleep herself. But she found that night it was so hot she couldn't be in her tent. It was stifling inside of there. And so she decides she's just going to sleep out in the open where it's a little bit cooler. And so she picks up her fold-up cot and she brings it out into the open, and she sees there are several other counselors who have done the same thing. And so she puts her cot down next to one of her good friends who's already asleep in her cot. And then Simone climbs into her cot, she gets under her covers, and she tries to fall asleep. But for the next hour, Simone just tosses and turns, she can't get comfortable. And by that time, everybody else has completely passed out. So it's just her, she's counting down the time until she has to get up again to start the next day. And so she's getting stressed about that. But eventually she would fall asleep. However, she would immediately be thrust into one of the most visceral and intense nightmares she had ever had in her entire life. In her dream, she opens her eyes and she looks out in front of her, and it's this desert city, and there are hundreds of people all in front of her, just standing there looking up at her. And then she notices on her left and on her right are these two men, these big, huge men that are both working on something behind her. She doesn't really know what it is, but they're obviously busy doing something. And she kind of glances up at one of them and she notices he's holding something that looks like a wreath, like a holiday wreath you would hang on your door. And so Simone looks away from the guy with the wreath and just looks back out at this huge sea of people, which is totally bizarre because no one's moving, no one's making any sound, they're just staring at her. And then she feels this shooting pain in the top of her head. The man who was standing on her right was not holding a holiday wreath. He was holding a crown of thorns, and now he, along with the guy on the other side of her, were working together to press this crown of thorns into her head. And so Simone is feeling the thorns being pressed deeper and deeper into her scalp. And she tries to fight them off, but she realizes she can't move. She can't even turn her head to look at them. She can only see them out of her periphery vision. And then she tries to scream out for help to someone in the crowd to come help her. But when she opens her mouth, no sound comes out. And so as she's sitting there, all she can do is stare straight out ahead of her as the pressure of these thorns are driven deeper and deeper into her skin. And then at some point, blood begins dripping down in front of her eyes. And around that point, the pain became so blinding, so awful that it woke her up. And as soon as she woke up, she shot up and she reached for her head to make sure there was no crown of thorns on her. And as she's doing that, she's thinking, okay, phew, it was just a dream. That was just a horrible dream. I'm in this forest. I'm good. I'm safe. And as she's kind of patting on her head, she's realizing her head is wet. And as she's touching her head, she's realizing it hurts. There's a stinging pain in her head. And then she realizes it's not just a stinging pain, it's a throbbing, intense pain all over her head. And so as she's kind of having this realization that her dream is now kind of segued into her real life, she looks out ahead of her and she sees off in the distance in the tree line, something is running through the woods. She can't tell who or what it is, but she makes a mental note that there is someone running away from them. But this pain in her head has gotten so intense that she can't focus on anything else. She can only focus on the pain. And as she's thinking about how much her head hurts, she screams in pain. And the girl who was laying next to her that had been asleep, she wakes up to the sound of the scream, but it's totally pitch black. She has no idea what's going on with Simone. And so this girl, she sits up and she's trying to get Simone to tell her what's going on, but Simone has no idea. She's totally frantic. She can't really make sense of what's happening. And so this friend, she reaches down and she picks up a flashlight, she turns it on, and she aims the light at Simone, illuminating her head. And when this friend sees Simone's head, she starts to scream. Seconds later, the rest of the counselors that had been sleeping out were awake, and they were rushing Simone, who was now shaking and vomiting, over to one of the staff vans. And then 15 minutes later, they had driven her to the emergency room. It would turn out, after Simone had finally fallen asleep and she began having that really intense dream about a crown of thorns being dug into her scalp, well, in reality, something was digging into her scalp and it was kind of manifesting itself in her dream. And what was digging into her scalp was the jaws of a fox. This fox had snuck into the campsite and walked right up behind Simone and just started eating her head. And amazingly, it did not wake Simone up right away. And so this fox got 20 or so serious bites out of Simone's head before she shot up and scared it away. And so almost certainly what Simone saw running away from her in that quick moment was the fox. Doctors were able to save Simone and stitch her head back together, and they were even able to hide all of the scars in her hairline so you can't even see them. But despite her being physically okay today, psychologically, this was a very traumatizing event. Not only does she refuse now to go into any forest, whether it's day or night, but she also periodically still gets phantom pains in her scalp that feels like the fox is biting her head all over again.